Hi, my name is Mark Turpin with 9line. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to cover the configuration of Communications Manager and Emergency Responder out of the box on version 14 to help essentially illustrate what your organization needs to have in place in order to be compliant with Kerry's Law and Raybaum's Act when utilizing Emergency Responder and also a subscription to our 9line service. So in today's video, we're going to go pretty quick here through a lot of the configuration items. I'm going to try to point out the highlights. Of course, if you have an existing deployment, you'll need to take into consideration your existing dial plan and any changes you might need to make. But this is really just showing you what you would do in order to go from start to finish to get your system online and compliant. Obviously, this is a demo, so not everything in here is real, and some of the things that you'll see me program probably don't fit into best practice, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and dig in. So the very first thing here on our screen on our new 14 install is a couple NAG messages. The top one is basically reminding you that you need to configure 911 and direct dial of 911 to the PSTN. That's part of the Kerry's Law requirement. The message down below tells us that we need to turn on emergency notifications. That's also part of Kerry's Law. So we're not going to configure that component today. We're going to use Emergency Responder to do our notifications. So we won't be using the integration with Call Manager and Single Wire and Formacast, but you could do that as well. So let's go ahead and dig in here. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at, basically we're going to follow along with the guides. So this is step by step, all the configuration we need. First thing I'm going to point out is that we've got our E911 partition that's in there by default. This comes now with your 14 installation and essentially has a couple of the pieces of groundwork that you need for your 911 pattern, partition, and CSS. You can choose to use these. I'm going to use some of it in today's demo. You don't have to use this, and if you're coming from an older system, you won't have these automatically created for you anyway, but they're really just here to kind of talk about how the call flow works. So E911 partitions here, we're going to go ahead and add some more partitions. Get our phones partition for our directory numbers. And then we're going to add another one for our PSTN pattern, so our ability to call outside. Okay, and now we need to set up our CSSs. Again, there's some defaults there. We're going to go ahead and add in an internal CSS. This is for extension to extension dialing. We'll also have our 911 pattern in here. And then a PSTN CSS so that we can make outside calls. And for the most part, we'll be doing the line device method for those of you that are curious. So our E911 CSS, this will be used by CER. So it's got access to the E911 patterns. Communications Manager group, I'm going to pause here real quick and talk about this. So the Communications Manager default group has auto registration enabled and you cannot turn it off. So we have to create a new one because the Emergency Responder guide tells us that we cannot have auto registration turned on in the CMG group or the CM group that Emergency Responder registers to. So that's why you're going to see me. I'm just going to create a placeholder group here. And we'll call it HQ and leave auto registration off. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and create a device pool that references that group so that we can drop everything into the HQ device pool. And we'll drop in some placeholders here. And again, not necessarily best practice configuration here today. I really just want to show you the basics of what we need to configure. We're going to create our route point here. So this is a special route point. I'm going to pause again real quick and talk about this. So Emergency Responder monitors for 911 calls via this route point. Now, the in-depth explanation of what route points are and so on is kind of outside the scope of this, but you need 3 if you have a publisher and subscriber emergency responder. You need 2 if you only have 1 emergency responder. And so depending on your deployment, you might have what I'm going to configure today, and you might have an extra one if you have that high availability server. So we're going to go ahead and create that route point and drop it into placeholders that we created. Give it the CSS so that it can reach the pattern specific to 911. And this is where our 911 pattern is actually going to go, is on this route point. We're going to put in the phone's partition so it's accessible. This is accessible via our internal CSS. I've already configured this in the past, so our 10911 patterns are there. And put a little caller ID here. 10911, let me just pause again real quick before we glance over that. That's going to come up later. You're going to see me configure that a little bit later, but essentially what that is saying is in the event that this route point should fail, which would happen in the event that emergency responder was down, we still want the call to go out to 911. And so we set the 10911 pattern, because that's the pattern that actually gets us to the outside. And then we've got the CSS set for the E911 CSS. Okay, we'll go on. And no voicemail, by the way, on this as well. So we've got our CSS is set. Let's go ahead and create our CTI ports. So the CTI ports are going to be used for the emergency responder callouts. So in the event that there's an emergency call, emergency responder has the ability to notify a security desk or a receptionist or somebody that needs to receive that notification. That's part of Carey's Law. And essentially that is how it communicates and plays the audio messages. This is basically a virtual phone, if you will. We'll go ahead and make this a anonymous device. This is not going to be owned by a particular user. And we'll go ahead and put security profile on it. We need a directory number in order to make the call out. We'll start with 6001. And we're going to put that in the phone's partition as well. And we'll give it a little bit of a name that makes sense. Go ahead and copy this using super copy, and we're going to create our second port. You can create as many of these ports as makes sense for your organization. I'm changing the directory number to 6002. Now I've already programmed this essentially to set up our system. I've set this up several times, so you see some of these things have kind of filled in, but essentially we're just creating the port the exact same way we did the 6001 port. Okay. And we want to make sure we've got everything configured. Looks like it is. Go ahead and go back. They're not going to register yet until our emergency responder's up. So now we're going to go over and create what we need for our trunk. So this is for incoming calls coming from our SIP trunk. So set up a partition. This partition is going to essentially handle the translations for incoming calls to map them to directory numbers. Let's go ahead and create a CSS that we can apply to our trunk for the incoming calling search space. And now we'll go ahead and configure our trunk. So we're going to just be simulating things today with an ISR. So it's just a standard SIP trunk. A little cube. And again, we're sticking with our HQ. And we'll go ahead and check these. All right, and now let's set our CSS to the one we just created. And then we need to tell it where to reach our trunk. And set a couple defaults there. Now we can go ahead and create our route patterns. Now you notice there is, I'm going to pause here real quick. So there is a pre-configured 911 pattern. One of the things you'll notice is that that route pattern doesn't go anywhere. It's not associated to a device or a gateway. So I'm just going to delete it and create the one that I want. And here we go. This is going to be our pattern to get out to the outside. Because remember, 911 is on the route point. 10911 is the route pattern we're going to use with emergency responder. So we're going to put it in the E911 partition. This is what emergency responder is actually going to call. Let me pause here once. Okay, so let me pause here now that we've got the route list configured. So emergency responder, when it makes a 911 call, because it's listening for the 911 pattern on its CTI route point, it's actually going to turn around and call 10911. And when it calls 10-911, our route pattern is going to be configured to turn it back into a 911 call when it sends it to the cube. But we need this special pattern here because it's essentially a pattern that's only accessible to emergency responder, and it is going to include the checkbox here for manipulating the external phone number mask. And that's how we map the ELIN. I've got my discard digits for pre-dot, and so now my route pattern is configured. We only need one when you're doing a integration with 9-line. Unless you've got multiple ways out that you want to configure across multiple cubes for that purpose, which is fine. We just need one way out. Configuring the ELIN now. I'm going to pause here at the initial ELIN configuration. Essentially what's happening is I'm creating what's called the default emergency response location ELIN. This is the phone number, and again, this is obviously a fake phone number. I'm just using it for demonstration purposes today, but this is the phone number that would be put on an outbound call if we have an unlocated phone. So if CER cannot determine where that phone is inside the organization, it's going to change the calling party number to basically 201-555-0000 in this particular case, and send it out to the outside world. And if that party gets disconnected and we need to reconnect the 911 dispatcher to that person, what's going to happen is the 911 dispatcher is going to see 201-555-0000 on her screen. So that's the number she's going to call back. When she calls it back, emergency responder is going to map that number to the internal extension that made the call. So what I'm configuring here, this translation pattern here, is for callback calls. This is not for outbound calls. This is for callback. In the event of a disconnect, this translation pattern will be matched. Notice I put it in the incoming partition, so our cube is going to see that there in its trunk CSS. And what's going to happen is we're going to match that pattern, and then we're going to go over to the E911 CSS to find the destination for it. And you'll see that that's going to be our 913. We're going to prefix it with 913, and that's going to relate to a route point I'm going to create in just a second. All right, so we'll go ahead and go on. I'm going to create a few of these for each of the ERLs and ELINs that we will have in our system. So there's our prefix of 913, and we'll just copy this. Okay, and now we're going to create the mapping for our ERL1. Everything stays the same, our E911 CSS, prefix with 913, and I'm going to do one more for ERL2. And again, everything's staying the same. And you're going to create these for every callback number, or every ELIN that you have. Now I'm going to create the route point. This route point is what CER uses to listen for callback calls. So when it sees a call that is 913 followed by 10 digits, and I'm going to program that pattern here as 913 plus 10 digits on the DN. And we'll label it as PSAP callback calls. So again, this is our 911 dispatcher is calling us back because we got disconnected, more than likely. And I'll go ahead and just do some labeling here, just for fun. Go ahead and save that. And now we'll go back. Okay, and so now we'll have a route point that when 913 plus a 10-digit pattern is matched, CER will pick it up. In order for CER to pick it up, we need a user to monitor those route points and control the CTI ports. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to go ahead and save my new user in the device association. And again, we're just following the the admin guide here, and we're going to create the groups that we need on our user. CTI enabled, of course, and calling party number modification. We need that so that we can change the number into the ELIN going out. And now we're going to create the other user that CER needs. This requires us to first create a custom access control group, and I'm going to assign the Axle access to this new group. We'll go ahead and add that to it. And the second user I'm creating, or in the process of creating, is the one that provides Axle connectivity or administrative XML connectivity for CER, so that CER can communicate with Communications Manager, excuse me. So we'll go ahead and get all the right permissions set on here. And one more. There we go. All right. And again, just following along with the admin guide here. So this is all standard stuff. Okay, now we need to tie that user into the emergency responder application server. This powers the OFP, so off-premises users. Put in just a descriptive name and the IP address of the system right there. We're going to pick the Axle user we just created. And we'll put in the URL. Okay, I'm going to pause here for just a second. So this application server component is really important. There's a lot of stuff happening underneath the covers right here on this one screen that you don't really get to see. So essentially what's happening is this is configuring the CER server and the URL that is used as part of the off-premises feature of Emergency Responder. This is how we enable support for remote workers. This is also helping configure a service that you don't really see anywhere in the Communications Manager, and it's called E911 Proxy. And so what we're saying is whenever a user is, or whenever a phone rather, is registering, we're going to send that information about that phone and the IP address of that phone over to Emergency Responder, and Emergency Responder via this E911 proxy service is going to determine whether or not that phone is, one, off-premise, and if it is, it's going to pass some information back to Communications Manager, who then puts information on the screen, which we'll show a live demo of that later. It actually sends a message to the phone, to the screen, via Communications Manager, and shows available locations that a user can pick from to say where they're at. And now a user has to create those, and we're going to show you how to create all those later. But just to point out, this is how we enable the off-premises feature from the Communications Manager side of the house. So it's a combination of the CER Axle user we created, the groups that we set up, and this application server configuration component inside Communications Manager. Okay, and now we go on. So go ahead and save that. And now we're going to create a user to actually use the off-premises feature. So we need to actually have a user that can register their phone and be tied to a phone so that they can pick their location. So I'm just going to create one for myself here. Go ahead and this is all basic user configuration stuff here, nothing fancy. I'm going to do a standard CUCM end users, CTI enabled because I'm going to give myself a Jabber client. And because I have an 8865, we'll get the extra permissions for it as well. And save that. Okay. Now let's go ahead and create my devices. So far we've only created my CTI ports, so I need a phone or a few. So let's go ahead and create my phone. And again, standard phone stuff here, nothing too wild. There's a feature here, or there's a feature checkbox, I should say, right here at the bottom. Require off-premise location. That is also what drives the off-premises feature. If we don't have that checkbox, the phone will not push the messages up to the screen about the off-premise location selection. So we have to have that checkbox. And we also have to have a phone button template, so we'll go ahead and get that configured too. All right, we'll go ahead and put a directory number on here. And I'm just going to put a 4-digit extension on here, no big deal. Pretty standard stuff. Drop it in our internal phones partition and give it a label and some names. And again, voicemail profile. Set up our CSS for internal dialing. Okay. And if we wanted, we could configure voicemail settings. No big deal if we don't. Again, just showing off the options here. All right, I'm going to pause right here. So the external phone number mask you'll notice I have this set as a 10-digit number. Currently, as of August 23rd, 2021, in CER, this needs to be a 10-digit number, and it needs to be a 10-digit value, and there needs to be an X for wildcard mask application to pull in the directory number up above into that phone number mask. This is just how emergency responder is configured to work right now. You have to have an X in the phone number mask field somewhere. Even if my phone number, which it is 314-310-7501, even if that's the case, I cannot put 7501 there. I need to have the X's present. I could use one X. I don't have to use 4, but I have to have those present. Otherwise, emergency responder will not pull that in for the off-premises feature. It's just how they wrote the logic. That is supposed to be seeing some changes in the future, and we'll see, when that happens. But for right now, you've got to have a number there that's a 10-digit DID. Second component is that has to be a DID. When we're dealing with off-premises users, we do not map an ELIN to that user. Right? Because there is no network discovery going on. Emergency responder is not trying to figure out which switch port you're plugged into. He knows he can't talk to you, and he knows he can't talk to the network infrastructure where you're plugged in. So he expects, CER expects, that external phone number mask is going to represent an actual DID that can be presented to the 911 dispatcher, and that in the event of disconnect, when they call that back, they're going to get connected to that party who called 911. So if I were to call 911, CER is still going to be in the mix. It's still going to be intercepting that call with the 911 route point, and all the notifications that CER is capable of providing are still going to occur. But the phone number mask is not going to be changed by some ELIN. And you'll see that later when we configure the off-premises ERL. There is no ELIN assigned to it. So, once again, have to have an X, has to be 10 digits, and must be a DID in order for this to work. Keep going here. All right, and now we're just going to configure my Jabber client, and standard stuff here. Basically the exact same stuff that we just did. Drop it in our device pool. Get our PSTN CSS, assign it to the user. Now, one thing I'm going to point out, I'm going to pause here real quick. Do not check the checkbox for require off-premise location. Do not check that. Jabber has no way to show a message on its screen and pick the location from within Jabber. This is not to be confused with the E911 notification URL that we're going to talk about later. That's completely different. This is about the off-premises functionality where on like an 8865 or an IP communicator, if you're still running an IP communicator, it can do it too, but it has to have XSI. It needs to be able to push a message to the phone screen, and only the physical phones and IP communicators can do that. So Jabber, if you pick this option here on Jabber, it will never be able to make a call and register correctly because the communications manager is going to be waiting for it to pick a location, and it can't pick a location, so it'll never register right. So even though the checkbox is here and present on the Jabber devices, do not pick it. Now, having said that, who knows, things might change in the future. So for right now, that's the way it works. Do not pick it. Go ahead and continue with our device security profile and SIP profile. Go ahead and get that configured on here. And now we're going to go drop a directory number on here. It'll be the same one we had before. Okay. All the same default stuff there. Associate. Okay. And we're done with our Jabber client. Go ahead and associate those devices to me. I'm going to need those devices associated to my user account, so when I log into the off-premises portal, I see the devices I can update. So this is how off-premises user portal knows which devices I'm allowed to modify. I'm going to modify the E911 messages here just to show it off. You can put whatever you want here. Your attorneys might have an opinion on this, but I'm just showing this is where you modify the messages that show up on the physical phone screen. So again, not Jabber. This is for the physical phones with that XSI type interface. Okay, and now let's configure the HTTP allow list on our Expressway-C. And I'll pause here real quick once we get it configured and talk to you about what everything means. So just setting the allowed methods here for the proxying type, match type, and the deployment. Okay, so essentially what's happening on this screen is, first is just a cosmetic description so we know what this rule is all about. The URL represents the FQDN for the communications manager and is telling the Expressway-C it can proxy traffic, it's allowed to proxy traffic from the Jabber client to the communications manager at this URL. And we're saying what kind of methods can you use and get post put. These are all just different methods in HTTP. The match type says prefix match, meaning match the beginning of the string. And then the deployment, this is a multi-deployment Expressway-C, so I'm picking the deployment for 9-line here. Now, the important thing to point out on this URL, this is again straight out of the configuration guide, but in older versions of Emergency Responder, or excuse me, in older versions of Communications Manager, just the host name sometimes would come through. So if you're running an older 12.5 type Communications Manager, you might want to take a look at your DNS suffix search because you might need to have that on there. If you're on 14, seems to be resolved now, so you're fine. Go ahead and using the full FQDN as well here. So and that's it on the HTTP allow list for the E911 proxy service. Again, remember, this is how the phone is communicating to Communications Manager so that it can be proxied over to Emergency Responder and fetch the locations that we're going to see when we do the live demo after we get everything configured. So a lot of this right now, I'm just laying the groundwork, putting the foundation down, and then we're going to go into how it all works in a live demo. Let's go back over to our Communications Manager and check on our phone. Hooray! Our 8865 is registered now. We'll keep track of the fact that it's in a 1099.30 subnet, which is a different subnet. This is a site-to-site VPN for this particular phone. And it's off-premise, but it's site-to-site VPN. And we'll talk about how we set all that up. So I'm going to go ahead and let's switch gears into some more Jabber work. So we'll go ahead and add new, and we're going to create our Jabber client config. This is, we used to do this via the XML file, now we just do it directly inside Communications Manager. So what we're going to do is create the E911 notification URL. And this is a URL, let me just pause here so you can kind of see what this looks like. Essentially, this URL is pointing towards a web page that you're hosting. So you can host this internal or external. I recommend external, so that people that are on MRA can see the URL. And essentially, whatever you put on that web page, and keep it basic because it's going to use an embedded browser inside Jabber, but whatever you put inside that URL or as that URL, the Jabber client is going to fetch and put into a pop-up message as the Jabber client launches. And the user has to acknowledge that message in order for them to register the client and be able to make a phone call. The Jabber client will not finish registration until you acknowledge the message. And essentially the idea here is we want to put up that same type of disclaimer that we saw on our E911 system messages that we can put onto the hard phones. We want to put something similar up there for our Jabber devices, because remember, Jabber doesn't support the XSI, so that off-premise location component doesn't work. So this is how we help remind that user, hey, you're working from home. You need to go and update your location and tell us where you're sitting at. So that's what this is for. And so once we've got that configured, you put whatever you're going to put in there for your system that makes sense for you. We'll assign it to the UC service. This is the default UC service. So we're going to go ahead and drop the Jabber config into it so that it applies to all of our users. And now whenever somebody logs in to the Jabber system, excuse me, whenever they log into the Communications Manager with Jabber, they're going to get that notice as well. And so you notice I've got this, it's already at the system default, but if you created a new one for testing, that's where you'd control it. All right, so we're basically done with the compliance part, but we still need to get rid of the notification message because we're going to use Emergency Responder. So we'll just go in here and disable that, and we're done with that nag message. Now let's just check. Make sure it comes back clear, and it does. All right, so we got rid of our 911 nag message because we have the route point, and we've got rid of the notification nag message because we've told it we're going to be doing something else, right? Emergency responder, we're not going to be using Formcast. Now, you can absolutely use Formcast for the notification instead of emergency responder. You don't have to, but emergency responder is already going to be intercepting the 911 call, so it takes a little extra work to do it with the Formcast when you've already got it in CER, but by no means do you have to do it in CER. So just know you've got that flexibility. It's not a either or. All right, and now let's move on. Okay, and so for this part, I'm going to jump back to the Expressway-C, and I'm going to add a new rule for our E911 notification URL. This is necessary because of a bug, and I'm just labeling this with that bug ID. And essentially, I'm going to use prefix match again, and basically say anything going to this URL is allowed to be proxied via the Expressway-C. So that way, when I'm outside the network, I can still get the pop-up message. If I don't do this, I will get a message that says unable to load the E911 notification message, and the Jabber client won't register, because if it can't load the message, you'll never get the OK button inside Jabber, which I'll show you later when we get into the demo. But essentially, that will prevent the ability to register the client, and your users will be very unhappy with you. Oh, and I should mention, the bug is a documentation bug on the allow list for the E911 notification URL. So when you're going through the documentation, it does not tell you that you need to go do this. So there's basically a documentation bug saying, hey, if you're going to deploy the E911 notification URL, first and foremost, you can't use any kind of scripts or link tags or anything like that inside the URL field itself, but also you need to go over to the Expressway and put it on the allow list. So it's not really like a bug, it's just a documentation bug. All right, so we're going to keep going here. What I'm going to walk through here is just essentially making sure all of our services are activated on our communications manager. So by default, these aren't turned on. So the things that I want to point out to you are obviously the call manager service itself, voice media streaming app and CTI manager, those are required. The TFTP, of course, is required. And then as we look down below, we've got the Axle web service that's required so that CER can talk using that Axle user and the Axle API. Serviceability I've got turned on, and then also DirSync is turned on for synchronizing our users. This will be important if you want to take advantage of LDAP integration and single sign-on. Need that turned on your communications manager because CER will essentially authenticate users by proxying that through communications manager, just like Jabber does. So pretty standard stuff there. The last thing I'm going to point out on the list here, while I've got this paused at the bottom, is the location-based tracking services. This is if you want the communications manager to interface directly with a WLC, you can actually have it, or a wireless LAN controller, you can actually have it talk to that wireless LAN controller and import all of the access points that controller controls. You don't have to do it that way. You can bulk load your access points and BSSIDs and the locations with them. It's out of the scope of today's presentation, but that's another feature that communications managers had for a couple versions now, where it essentially can talk to the WLC for you and import those access points. Not required, but very nice to have if you do have a large wireless network. So essentially make sure we've got everything activated and started. Looks good. I'm going to go over here and configure my SNMP string. And we need this because CER is going to talk to Communications Manager via CER as well as Axle, so that it can query the status of phones and so on. So and do its phone discovery. Go and make this a read-only. Doesn't need any other privileges. If we had a cluster, we'd use the Apply to All Nodes field. Go ahead and save this. It's going to restart the SNMP service for you to apply that new community string. And we're good. So that's now applied. Obviously, of course, you might want to use a more secure community string than what I'm using in this demo. All right, so that wraps it up on the communications manager side of the house. We have our basic configuration laid down. We've set up the route plan for the most part. It's not a complete route plan for PSTN patterns, but it's going to work for us for 911 stuff. And now we also have the Expressway-C configured to allow that traffic to come through and hit the E911 proxy service as well as the E911 notification URL. We've done a lot of work in a short amount of time, so great work and following along. And stay tuned for the next one. We're going to go into CER. Talk to you soon.